On the morning of March 14, 1840, Constable William McBride pushed open the kennel door at the rear of Drummond's Flax mill in Newry, County Down, Ireland. The establishment was renowned throughout Ulster for its racing greyhounds, sleek animals that commanded prices exceeding £20 sterling at the Belfast markets. What the constable found between the feeding troughs would haunt him until his death 40 years later. The body of Catherine O'Neill, age 11, lay curled among the straw and dog waste. Her stomach was distended despite her skeletal frame. Her fingers were still clutching a piece of raw mutton, the same cuts fed to the mill owner's prized racing dogs. The forensic examination would reveal that Catherine had been surviving on scraps from the kennel for weeks. But what killed her wasn't starvation. The bruising pattern across her skull and ribs told a different story. Someone had beaten Catherine O'Neill to death for the crime of being hungry enough to steal food meant for animals. The truth behind her death would expose a system where children were worth less than dogs, and the man responsible would never spend a single day in prison. Before we uncover the horrifying truth about how an 11-year-old girl died fighting dogs for scraps while her employer's greyhounds ate better than most Irish families, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We bring you the forgotten atrocities of history, the stories erased from textbooks but written in blood and suffering. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's descend into the darkness of Victorian-era Ireland, where a child's life was valued at less than a racing dog's dinner. The year 1840 marked the midpoint of what historians would later call Ireland's pre-Famine twilight, those deceptive years before the Great Hunger when warning signs already screamed from every workhouse and mill town. In Newry, a market town straddling the border between County Down and County Armagh, the linen industry thrived while its workers starved in plain sight. The town's geography made it ideal for textile production. The Clanrye River powered dozens of mills, and the newly completed canal connected Newry to both Belfast and Dublin, making it a crucial hub in the Irish linen trade. By 1840, Newry boasted 23 flax mills employing over 4,000 workers, 60% of them children under the age of 14. James Drummond had owned his flax mill on Mill Street since 1822. A Presbyterian of Scottish descent, Drummond represented the new merchant class that dominated Northern Ireland's industrial landscape. His mill processed raw flax into linen thread, employing approximately 200 workers across 3 floors of machinery that ran 16 hours per day, 6 days per week. But Drummond's true passion wasn't linen, it was greyhound racing. Throughout the 1830s, Drummond had cultivated a reputation as one of Ulster's premier greyhound breeders. His dogs competed at coursing events from Dublin to Edinburgh, with his champion bitch Queen Mab selling for an unprecedented £45 in 1838. The kennels behind his mill housed 22 racing greyhounds at any given time, each animal receiving individual attention from a dedicated kennel master named Hugh Dornan. The contrast between the care lavished on these animals and the treatment of Drummond's human workers should have scandalized polite society. It didn't. In the economic philosophy of the time, this made perfect sense. A quality greyhound represented significant capital investment and potential profit. The dogs were assets requiring protection and maintenance. Child laborers, conversely, were abundant and replaceable. Belfast workhouses overflowed with orphans and destitute families desperate for any employment, no matter how meager the wages or brutal the conditions. Catha. Ryan O'Neill had entered Drummond's employment in November 1839. Age 11, alongside her younger brother Thomas, age 9. Their mother had died of consumption that autumn, and their father, a day laborer, could no longer feed 5 children on irregular wages. Catherine and Thomas were hired as doffers, children who replaced full bobbins of thread on the spinning machines. The work paid 2 shillings per week, barely enough to afford the cheapest lodgings and a few pounds of oatmeal, but it was employment, and in the Newry of 1840, employment meant survival. Or so Catherine's father believed when he signed the indenture papers. The O'Neill children joined approximately 80 other juvenile workers at Drummond's mill. They labored from 5 in the morning until 9 at night, with 2 15-minute breaks for meals. The mill floor operated at temperatures exceeding 90 degrees to keep the flax fibers pliable. Children worked barefoot to avoid damaging the threads, their feet developing chronic ulcers from the combination of heat, humidity, and the caustic chemicals used to process the flax. The machinery claimed fingers and hands with mechanical regularity. The flax dust filled young lungs, causing a respiratory condition the workers called pus, what modern medicine would recognize as bisonosis or brown lung disease. Children routinely fainted from heat exhaustion and malnutrition, revived with buckets of cold water and sent back to their positions. This was entirely legal. This was entirely normal. What happened next would expose just how far the devaluation of human life could descend when profit became the only moral compass. The first person to notice Catherine O'Neill's deteriorating condition was her fellow doffer, Margaret Riley, aged 12. In her later testimony to the coroner's inquest, Margaret recalled that by mid-January 1840, Catherine had become terrible thin, like a walking skeleton. She told me she was getting only one meal most days, Margaret testified. Her wages had been docked for breaking bobbins and there wasn't enough left for proper food. She said she was so hungry her stomach felt like it was eating itself. The wage docking system at Drummond's mill operated with mathematical precision to ensure maximum profit extraction. Workers paid fines for talking, for sitting down, for arriving minutes late, for damaging equipment, for working too slowly. A child might earn 2 shillings per week but take home only 9 pence after fines, barely enough for 3 pounds of oatmeal, which provided insufficient calories for the physical demands of mill work. Catherine's situation had become particularly dire. In December, she'd fainted at her station and fallen into the machinery, damaging a spinning frame. The repairs cost 18 pence, nearly a month's wages after fines. Drummond's foreman, Samuel Crawford, informed Catherine that the debt would be deducted from her pay at 3 pence per week. For the next 6 weeks, Catherine O'Neill earned essentially nothing. Her brother Thomas, still too young and small to handle the heavier machinery, earned only 18 pence weekly. Not enough to feed them both. Their father, when he found work, sent what he could, but winter labor was scarce. Catherine began to starve in earnest. On February 3, 1840, kennel master Hugh Dornan discovered Catherine in the Greyhound kennels after the evening shift. She was on her hands and knees attempting to reach the feeding bowls. The dogs, well fed and docile, had simply moved aside, uninterested in the scraps they'd already consumed. Dornan's testimony to the inquest reveals the casual cruelty of the situation. I grabbed the girl by her collar and dragged her out of the kennel. I asked her what in God's name she was doing. She said she was hungry and wanted to see if the dogs had left anything. I told her those dogs eat better than the likes of her, and she had no business being near Mr. Drummond's property. I gave her a few kicks to teach her a lesson and sent her off. A few kicks for trying to eat. But Dornan reported the incident to Foreman Crawford, who reported it to James Drummond himself. The mill owner's response would establish the pattern that led to Catherine's death. According to Crawford's testimony, Drummond stated, "The girl is clearly a thief. If she's hungry, she should work harder and earn her keep honestly. Post a notice that any worker found near the kennels will be dismissed immediately and reported to the magistrate for attempted theft." The notice went up the next morning. But Catherine's hunger didn't abate. It couldn't. The human body requires a minimum caloric intake to function, and Catherine was receiving perhaps a third of what she needed. On February 17th, Thomas O'Neill approached Foreman Crawford directly, begging for an advance on his wages to buy food for his sister. Crawford refused, noting that the mill's policy prohibited advances. Thomas pleaded, explaining that Catherine had become so weak she could barely walk to the mill in the mornings. Crawford's response, documented in the inquest, "Then perhaps she should find employment better suited to her constitution. Mr. Drummond's mill requires able-bodied workers, not invalids who cost more than they produce." The threat of dismissal hung over Catherine like an axe. Losing her position at the mill would mean complete destitution. The workhouse, where conditions were deliberately kept worse than the worst employment to discourage dependency on public relief. So Catherine continued working, growing weaker by the day, her body consuming its own muscle tissue to survive. Margaret Riley remembered February 28th with particular clarity. Catherine fainted 3 times that day. The 3rd time Mr. Crawford made us throw water on her, but she didn't wake straight away. When she did come round, she was crying and saying she couldn't see properly. Everything was going dark around the edges, she said. Starvation affects vision. The body, desperate for energy, begins shutting down non-essential systems. Peripheral vision narrows. Focus becomes difficult. These are the brain's final warning signals before catastrophic system failure. That night, Catherine O'Neill made a decision born of desperation and the primal human drive to survive. She returned to the kennels. Hugh Dornan didn't discover her on March 1st, though she'd been there for several hours after her shift ended. She'd waited until full darkness, slipping through the yard behind the mill to the long wooden structure that housed Drummond's greyhounds. The dogs knew her by now. She wasn't a threat, just another fixture of the mill's landscape. The feeding bowls still contained remnants of that evening's meal, raw mutton, bone shards, congealed fat. Food that would have been discarded in any case. Food that represented more nutrition than Catherine had seen in weeks. She ate directly from the bowls, later evidence would suggest. Ate until her shrunken stomach cramped. Then she hid in the straw, terrified of being caught but unable to walk home in her weakened state. This pattern continued for at least 5 nights, possibly more. Catherine would work her 16-hour shift, then hide in the kennels, eating the dog's leavings and sleeping in the straw until just before the morning shift began. It couldn't last. On the night of March 13th, Hugh Dornan decided to check his kennels after hours. One of the greyhounds had shown signs of lameness that afternoon, and Dornan wanted to examine the animal away from the noise of the mill. He brought a lantern and a walking stick, a heavy oak staff he carried for protection when moving through Newry's rougher districts. What happened in those kennels between Dornan and Catherine O'Neill became the subject of intense legal scrutiny and contradictory testimony. But the physical evidence told a story that no amount of verbal misdirection could completely obscure. If story is giving you chills, hit that like button, and share this with someone who needs to understand the true cost of unregulated capitalism and the devaluation of human life. What happened next in those kennels would force Victorian society to confront an uncomfortable question. At what point does profit-seeking become murder? Let's discover what Constable McBride found the next morning. Constable William McBride received the summons at approximately 7:15 on the morning of March 14, 1840. A boy had run to the police station reporting that Hugh Dornan needed immediate assistance at Drummond's mill. There had been an accident in the kennels. McBride, a veteran of 15 years with the Newry Constabulary, had investigated numerous industrial accidents. The mills produced them with grim regularity. Crushed limbs, scalping injuries where hair was caught in machinery, children who fell into the mechanical works and emerged as something less than human. He expected another workplace tragedy. What he found was something far more deliberate. The kennel door stood open. Morning light slanted through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating dust motes and the steam of the greyhound's breath in the cold March air. The dogs themselves were penned in the far section, away from the feeding area. Someone had moved them, which suggested the discovery had already been made and the scene disturbed. Hugh Dornan stood near the entrance, his face pale, a walking stick clutched in one hand. The wood showed dark stains. "I didn't mean to kill her," Dornan said before McBride could speak. "I swear before God I only meant to teach her a lesson." Catherine O'Neill's body lay between 2 feeding troughs in what the subsequent forensic examination would term a defensive posture. Arms raised, knees drawn up, as if trying to protect herself from blows. The positioning told its own story. McBride's official report, preserved in the County Down archives, provides clinical detail. The deceased was a female child of approximately 11 years, dressed in millworker's clothing consisting of a thin cotton dress and no shoes. The body exhibited severe emaciation consistent with prolonged malnutrition. Multiple contusions were visible on the face, arms, and torso. The skull showed evidence of significant trauma above the left ear. Blood had pooled beneath the body and soaked into the straw bedding. In the child's right hand, a piece of raw mutton, clutched even in death. The kennel master's walking stick, when examined, showed blood, hair, and tissue consistent with having struck human flesh with considerable force, multiple times. Dr. Robert Patterson arrived within the hour to conduct a preliminary examination. Patterson, who served as Newry's police surgeon, had performed hundreds of post-mortem examinations. His notes from Catherine O'Neill's case revealed growing horror at what he documented. The child's body weight is approximately 42 pounds, at least 20 pounds below what would be expected for a female of her age and height. Muscle tissue shows severe wasting. The abdomen is distended, consistent with protein deficiency and possible fluid accumulation. Multiple healed fractures are evident in the fingers and left forearm, suggesting previous industrial accidents. The fatal injuries consist of blunt force trauma to the skull resulting in a depressed fracture above the left temporal region, extensive bruising to the torso consistent with repeated kicks or stamps, 3 broken ribs on the right side, and severe bruising to the arms consistent with defensive wounds. The stomach contents include partially digested raw meat, mutton, by appearance, and a foreign material that I believe to be canine saliva mixed with straw particles. This child had been eating from the dog feeding bowls. In my professional opinion, death resulted from traumatic brain injury inflicted by repeated blows to the head with a heavy object, likely the walking stick recovered from the scene. The pattern of injuries suggests the victim was on the ground when many of the blows were delivered. This was not a momentary loss of control. The severity and distribution of wounds indicate sustained, deliberate violence. Constable McBride arrested Hugh Dornan on the spot, charging him with murder. But the investigation had only begun, and its scope would expand far beyond a single violent kennel master. Because as Dr. Patterson continued his examination, a disturbing question emerged. Where had Catherine been sleeping? The straw in one corner of the kennel showed signs of repeated use, compressed into a nest-like depression, with additional scraps of mutton hidden beneath. The child hadn't arrived at the kennels for the first time on March 13th. She'd been living there secretly for at least several nights, possibly more than a week. Margaret Riley, questioned by police, confirmed Catherine's absence from the lodging house, where both girls rented sleeping space. She told me she'd found somewhere warmer to stay, Margaret testified. Said she'd be fine not to worry about her. Catherine O'Neill had been so desperate to survive that she'd chosen to sleep alongside racing dogs, eating their scraps, hiding from the humans who should have protected her. The greyhounds themselves showed no signs of aggression or distress. They'd apparently accepted the child's presence without incident. In the final analysis, the dogs had treated Catherine O'Neill with more compassion than her human employers. As news of the discovery spread through Newry, additional witnesses began coming forward with information that painted an even darker picture of conditions at Drummond's mill. But it was the testimony of Thomas O'Neill, Catherine's 9-year-old brother, that would prove most damaging. Thomas told investigators that 3 days before his sister's death, Foreman Samuel Crawford had caught Catherine near the kennels during the evening. Crawford had struck her repeatedly and threatened to have her transported to Australia for theft if he caught her near Mr. Drummond's property again. She showed me the bruises, Thomas testified, his small voice barely audible in the inquest chamber. Her whole back was purple. She was crying and said she didn't know what to do. She was so hungry, and the dogs had so much food. She said it wasn't fair that animals ate meat every day while children starved. Catherine O'Neill's final words to her brother: "If I have to choose between stealing and dying, I'm going to steal." To wake up and finally learn to stay away. I didn't check on her until morning. By then it was too late. This testimony reveals layers of calculated brutality masked as maintenance of property rights. Dornan had beaten an 11-year-old child unconscious, left her overnight in an unheated kennel in March, and felt his primary error was misjudging the force of his blows, not the act itself. The testimony of James Drummond proved even more chilling in its bureaucratic detachment. I employed approximately 200 workers, the majority being children. I cannot be expected to personally monitor the health and welfare of each individual. That responsibility falls to my foremen and their subordinates. The girl had been warned multiple times about approaching the kennels. She was explicitly forbidden from the area. If she chose to disobey direct orders and engage in theft, the consequences of her actions cannot be laid at my doorstep. My greyhounds are fed according to a specific dietary regimen designed by experts to maintain peak athletic performance. The meat and supplements they receive represent a significant investment in their health and competitive value. To suggest that this food should be diverted to workers who are adequately compensated for their labor is absurd. If the girl was hungry, she should have worked harder to avoid fines, or she should have sought employment elsewhere better suited to her capabilities. Drummond's testimony sparked outrage among the inquest observers, particularly when he claimed his workers were adequately compensated. Witnesses had already established that child workers earned as little as 9 pence weekly after fines, roughly 1/4 the cost of feeding a single greyhound for the same period. Dr. Patterson's medical testimony devastated any remaining sympathy for the defense. The child didn't die from a single blow or momentary violence. She died from sustained, deliberate beating that continued well after she was incapacitated. The skull fracture alone would have rendered her unconscious. The broken ribs and torso bruising occurred after that point. They show no defensive characteristics because she was no longer capable of defending herself. Furthermore, the state of malnutrition was so severe that this child would have died within weeks even without violence. Her body was consuming its own organs. She was in the end stage of starvation, a condition that takes months to develop and which any observant supervisor should have noticed and addressed. The inquest jury, composed of 12 local merchants and property owners, deliberated for 6 hours. Their verdict shocked many observers but surprised few who understood the class dynamics of Victorian Ireland. We find that Catherine O'Neill died as a result of injuries inflicted by Hugh Dornan. However, we note that Mr. Dornan acted in defense of his employer's property against a known thief. While the force used was excessive and resulted in unintended death, we cannot characterize this as willful murder. We recommend that Hugh Dornan be charged with manslaughter. We find no criminal culpability on the part of James Drummond or his foreman, as they had established clear policies prohibiting workers from approaching the kennels. The jury added a rider to their verdict that revealed the cognitive dissonance at the heart of the case. We recommend that Parliament consider legislation regulating the working conditions and minimum wages of juvenile mill workers, as the current system appears to create circumstances conducive to theft and disorder. Catherine O'Neill's death was tragic, in other words, but the real problem was that starving children might steal. The solution wasn't to prevent starvation, it was to regulate theft. Hugh Dornan stood trial for manslaughter at the County Down Spring Assizes on April 29, 1840. The trial lasted 2 days. The defense argued that Dornan had acted reasonably to protect valuable property, that Catherine had been warned repeatedly, and that her death, while unfortunate, resulted from her own criminal behavior and unexpected physical fragility. The prosecution, led by Crown Solicitor James Murphy, painted a different picture. Gentlemen of the jury, you are asked to believe that beating an 11-year-old girl to death for eating scraps is reasonable behavior. You are asked to accept that a child's life is worth less than the feeding bowl of a racing dog. You are asked to make Catherine O'Neill responsible for her own murder because she had the audacity to be hungry in the richest empire the world has ever known. Hugh Dornan didn't strike Catherine O'Neill once in a moment of anger. He beat her repeatedly, methodically, while she screamed for mercy. He beat her until she lost consciousness. He beat her after she'd fallen to the ground and could no longer defend herself. Then he left her to die in the cold and darkness, surrounded by animals that showed her more compassion than any human employer. This is not defensive property. This is murder. And if we as a civilized society cannot protect our most vulnerable from such barbarity, then we are not civilized at all. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty of manslaughter, with a recommendation for mercy based on Dornan's previously good character and his stated lack of intent to kill. Judge Samuel Warren sentenced Dornan to 18 months of hard labor, the minimum sentence allowed by law. James Drummond faced no charges. Samuel Crawford faced no charges. No mill owner or overseer faced any legal consequences for the system that had starved Catherine O'Neill to the point where stealing dog food seemed like her only chance at survival. Dornan served 11 months of his sentence before being released early for good behavior. He left Ireland for Scotland in 1841 and disappears from historical records, likely living under a different name. James Drummond continued operating his mill until 1847, when the Great Famine devastated Ireland's workforce and linen industry. He sold his business and retired to Belfast, where he died in 1856 at age 68, having never publicly expressed remorse for Catherine O'Neill's death. His obituary in the Belfast newsletter praised his contributions to Ulster's industrial development and his renowned greyhound breeding program. The kennels where Catherine died were demolished in 1843. The location is now a car park. Thomas O'Neill, Catherine's brother, survived the Great Famine and emigrated to New York in 1849. Family records suggest he became a labor organizer, fighting for workers' rights until his death in 1891. He named his first daughter Catherine. As for Catherine O'Neill herself, she was buried in a pauper's grave in Newry's Church Street Cemetery on March 16, 1840. No headstone marked the location. Her grave's exact position has been lost to time and poor record-keeping. 62 people attended her funeral, all of them child workers from Drummond's mill and other Newry factories. They pooled their meager wages to buy a single flower to place on her coffin. James Drummond didn't attend. He was at a greyhound racing event in Dublin that weekend. One of his dogs won first prize. Catherine O'Neill's death did not spark immediate legislative reform or public outrage beyond Newry's immediate vicinity. The case appeared in local newspapers as a tragic accident, a cautionary tale about the dangers of theft and disobedience, an unfortunate incident that nevertheless shouldn't interfere with industrial progress. But the case file didn't disappear. The testimony, the medical evidence, the stark documentation of a system that valued dogs over children, all of it entered the public record, where it would resurface at crucial moments in the fight for labor reform. In 1842, Parliament's Children's Employment Commission published its second report, investigating conditions in mines and factories across Britain and Ireland. The commissioners referenced Catherine O'Neill's case multiple times as evidence of the urgent need for regulation. Commissioner R.H. Horne wrote, "The death of Catherine O'Neill in Newry represents not an aberration but the logical endpoint of a system that treats children as machinery, as tools to be used until broken, then discarded. When the life of a child is worth less than the feeding cost of a racing dog, we have abandoned any pretense of Christian civilization." The 1844 Factory Act, while limited in scope, included provisions directly influenced by cases like Catherine's. The act restricted children under 13 to working no more than 6.5 hours daily, required 2 hours of daily education, and mandated basic safety standards. Enforcement remained weak, and countless children continued to suffer, but the legislative trajectory had shifted. More significantly, Catherine's case became a rallying point for early labor organizers and social reformers. Friedrich Engels referenced the case in his 1845 work, The Condition of the Working Class in England, noting, A child dies beaten for stealing food meant for dogs, and the employer suffers no consequence. This is not an anomaly of capitalism. This is capitalism, stripped of its polite veneer and revealed in its essential brutality. The case influenced Charles Dickens, who was gathering research for his industrial novels in the early 1840s. While no direct evidence links Catherine's story to specific characters, the themes of child exploitation, indifferent employers, and the stark contrast between animal welfare and human suffering appear throughout Hard Times and other works. By the 1860s, Catherine O'Neill's name had become shorthand in reform circles for the worst excesses of unregulated industrial capitalism. Suffragettes invoked her memory when arguing that if women had the vote, such atrocities would be prevented. Labor unions referenced her case when demanding living wages and maximum hour laws. Child welfare advocates used her story to push for compulsory education and minimum age requirements. The parallels to other cases emerged with disturbing regularity. In 1843, a 9-year-old boy died in a Manchester mill after being beaten for falling asleep at his station. He'd been working a 19-hour shift. In 1851, 3 girls died in a Glasgow factory fire because the employer had locked the exits to prevent theft of materials. In 1863, parliamentary investigators discovered that London match factories routinely employed 6-year-olds who developed phosphorus necrosis, phossy jaw, from the chemicals they handled. Each case revealed the same underlying truth: when human beings are reduced to economic units, when profit becomes the sole measure of value, the vulnerable die in predictable patterns. But Catherine's case also revealed something else: the extraordinary cognitive dissonance required to maintain such systems. James Drummond didn't see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a successful businessman, a pillar of the community, a respected breeder of fine dogs. The jury that spared his kennel master from a murder conviction didn't believe they were excusing child killing. They believed they were protecting property rights and maintaining social order. This is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of Catherine O'Neill's death: the evidence that ordinary people, given the right economic incentives and social conditioning, can rationalize almost any atrocity. The same men who lavished care on their dogs, who attended church every Sunday, who considered themselves moral and upstanding citizens, these men created and maintained a system that worked children to death and called it progress. The psychological mechanisms haven't disappeared. The same patterns appear in modern sweatshops, in child labor supply chains, in any economic system that abstracts human suffering into balance sheets and profit margins. The names change, the technology advances, the fundamental dynamic remains. Some lives are valued, protected, and nurtured. Others are exploited, discarded, and forgotten. Catherine O'Neill's story asks uncomfortable questions that every generation must answer anew. What is a human life worth? Who decides? And what are we willing to tolerate in the name of economic efficiency? The racing greyhounds of 1840 Ulster are long dead. So are the men who valued them above children. But the systems they built, the logic they employed, the rationalizations they constructed, these have proven far more durable than any of the participants could have imagined. Catherine O'Neill died for the crime of being hungry. She died because the market had determined her labor was worth 9 pence per week after fines. She died because a dog's dinner represented more economic value than a child's life. We remember her because her death wasn't unique. It was systemic. And systems, unlike individual tragedies, can be changed, but only if we're willing to see them clearly, to acknowledge what they cost, and to accept that business as usual often means business built on bones. What do you think drove Hugh Dornan to beat an 11-year-old child to death? Was it genuine belief in his right to protect his employer's property? Was it the dehumanization that comes from viewing workers as economic units rather than human beings? Or was it simply the banal evil of a man following incentives in a system designed to reward cruelty? Leave your theories in the comments below. Tell us what you think about a society that valued racing dogs over human children. And if this story has affected you, consider researching modern supply chains and labor practices. The exploitation hasn't ended. It simply moved to places where cameras and regulators are scarce. Subscribe to The Silent Abbey for more lost chapters of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the systems we build. Ring that notification bell so you never miss the stories they tried to erase. Catherine O'Neill's grave has no marker, but her story remains. Remember her, remember what she died for, and ask yourself, what would we rather forget about our own economic systems? See you in the next video.